Life has a funny way of throwing surprises at you. I'm Hannah, a 25-year-old woman who learned this lesson in the most unexpected place, a bustling coffee shop on a busy Tuesday morning. That day, my life took a turn when I crossed paths with Chris, a man who seemed to step right out of a story of everyday heroism. The coffee shop was my sanctuary, a place away from the high expectations of my wealthy family. I sat at my usual corner table, sipping a latte and scrolling through my phone, when I heard snickers behind me. It was the Johnson twins, notorious bullies from my college days. "Look who's here, all alone. Daddy's little girl," sneered Mark, the taller of the two. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my phone, but they weren't done. "I bet that purse costs more than our rent," added Matt, his voice dripping with mockery. Feeling my cheeks burn, I muttered under my breath, "Just leave me alone." That's when Chris, who until that moment was just another customer, stepped in. He was tall, with a rugged look and a confident stance. "Guys, cut it out. She's not bothering you," Chris said, his voice calm but authoritative. Mark laughed mawkishly. "And who are you, her knight in shining armor?" Chris didn't flinch. "Just a guy who hates bullies. Why don't you pick on someone who fights back?" The twins looked taken aback. Matt retorted, "We're just having a bit of fun, man. No need to get worked up." Chris's gaze was unwavering. "It's not fun if she's not laughing. How about showing some respect?" The tension was thick. The twins exchanged a glance, shrugged, and walked away, muttering insults under their breath. Chris turned to me, his face softening. "Sorry about that. Some people just can't grow up. You okay?" he asked, a genuine concern in his eyes. I was still processing the swift change in events. "Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks for stepping in. That was really brave of you." Chris just smiled and shrugged it off. "I'm Chris, by the way. Couldn't just stand by and watch." "I'm Hannah. You really didn't have to do that, but I'm grateful." We ended up talking more. Chris was funny, with a no-nonsense attitude and a surprisingly warm smile. He told me about his job at a local mechanic shop and his passion for fixing up old cars. It was refreshing to talk to someone so grounded and real. As our conversation flowed, I realized how easy it was to talk to him. He listened intently, laughed at my jokes, and shared stories of his own. He had this effortless charm about him that was hard to ignore. When it was time to leave, I found myself wishing the conversation didn't have to end. Chris walked me to the door, and we exchanged numbers. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. Meeting Chris felt like the beginning of something new and unexpected. It's funny how life works. One moment you're just going about your day, and the next, you meet someone who changes everything. That day in the coffee shop, I met Chris, and little did I know, my life was about to change in ways I couldn't have imagined. Meeting Chris, who had bravely stood up for me at a coffee shop, had quickly turned my life into a whirlwind romance. First came the visit to Chris's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, in their cozy suburban home. Mrs. Johnson, a petite woman with a big heart, greeted us with open arms. "Chris. And this must be Hannah. We've heard so much about you." I felt a warmth in her embrace. "It's really nice to meet you, Mrs. Johnson," I said, smiling. "Oh, please, call me Linda," she insisted, leading us into a living room that felt lived in and welcoming. Mr. Johnson, a tall man with a firm handshake, joined us. "Welcome, Hannah. We're glad Chris found someone special." The conversation over dinner was heartfelt. They asked about my life, and for the first time, I felt valued for who I was, not for my family's wealth. The real challenge, however, was introducing Chris to my parents. My father, a real estate tycoon, and my mother, a high-profile lawyer, had standards as high as skyscrapers. Their reception was polite but cold. "Dad, Mom, this is Chris." I introduced him, trying to mask my nervousness. Chris, maintaining his composure, extended a handshake. "Mr. and Mrs. Anderson, it's an honor to meet you." My dad's handshake was firm, his eyes scrutinizing. "Chris, I hear you work at a mechanic shop. Tell me, how do you plan to provide for my daughter?" Chris didn't miss a beat. "I'm saving up, sir. Planning to run my own shop someday." The dinner felt more like an interrogation, with my dad throwing sharp questions, almost challenging Chris's worth. After Chris left, my dad summoned me to his study. "Hannah, that boy isn't right for you," he said, his voice stern. He slid a folder across his desk towards me. "I've done some digging. You need to see this." Furious, I pushed the folder back without opening it. "I can't believe you'd stoop this low. I trust Chris." "Hannah, don't be a fool," he retorted, his voice rising. "This isn't just a game. It's your future." I grabbed the folder, tore it in half, and stormed out, leaving the pieces on the floor. I was fuming. How dare he pry into Chris's life and judge him without knowing him? That night, I lay in bed, my mind racing. Part of me wondered if I was too quick to dismiss my father's concerns, but my heart was steadfast. Chris was the man I loved, and no background check was going to change that. As our wedding day approached, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of requests from Chris and his parents. It all started one evening at Chris's house, a few months before the wedding. "Hannah, we were thinking," Chris started, a hint of hesitation in his voice. "Since you, well, you know, have the means, could you maybe cover the wedding expenses?" His parents, Linda and Mr. Johnson, nodded in agreement, their eyes hopeful yet a bit too eager. I was taken aback but masked my surprise with a smile. "Sure, I can do that. It's our special day, after all." As the weeks passed, their requests grew. We were at a high-end boutique, selecting wedding attire when Linda pointed at an extravagant dress. "Oh, Hannah, this is beautiful, but it's so pricey." I caught the hint. "Don't worry, Linda. If you like it, it's yours." Mr. Johnson chimed in, eyeing a suit. "Well, if we're all dressing up, might as well go all out, right?" I laughed, a bit nervously, and nodded. "Of course, Mr. Johnson." Their gratitude was short-lived and soon turned into expectation. Every meeting brought a new request. "Hannah, dear, could we add this to the menu? Or, how about a bigger flower arrangement?" I found myself agreeing each time, partly because I was in love and partly because I didn't want to disappoint them. But deep down, I felt a twinge of resentment at their growing entitlement. On the wedding day, everything was lavish, paid for from my pocket. Chris looked dashing, and his parents were beaming in their expensive outfits. My parents arrived, their expressions stiff. After the ceremony, during the reception, my father stood up to speak. The room fell silent. "Hannah has always lived a life of luxury," he began, his voice stern. "But it's time she learned the real world. As of today, she's financially cut off." A wave of whispers swept through the room. I felt my face flush with embarrassment. Chris squeezed my hand, his expression a mix of shock and worry. "Dad, you can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "This is for your own good, Hannah. You need to learn to fend for yourself," he replied, unyielding. The rest of the evening felt surreal. Chris and his parents were unusually quiet. As we left, Chris pulled me aside. "Hannah, what are we going to do?" I forced a smile. "We'll manage, Chris. We have each other." But as we drove away, a sinking feeling settled in my stomach. My father's words echoed in my ears, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that my once blissful relationship was about to face its toughest test yet. The honeymoon period didn't last long after the wedding. I quickly realized that my marriage to Chris was going to be nothing like I had imagined. The shift was abrupt and jarring. We moved into Chris's parents' house temporarily, or so I thought. The first morning, I came down to breakfast and was met with cold stares from Linda and Mr. Johnson. The air was thick with tension. "Morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. Linda didn't look up from her coffee. "You should start looking for a job, Hannah. We can't afford to feed an extra mouth here." I was taken aback. "Oh, I thought. I mean, Chris and I talked about me finding something, but I didn't expect." Mr. Johnson cut in, his tone harsh. "Well, your father cut you off, right? Time to pull your weight." I looked at Chris, hoping for some support, but he just stared at his plate. The loving, caring man I married seemed to have vanished. The following days were worse. Chris had turned cold and distant. One evening, as we were clearing the dinner table, he said, "You need to start contributing, Hannah. It's not fair to my parents." I felt a lump in my throat. "Chris, I'm trying. I didn't expect things to change this fast." He scoffed. "Welcome to the real world, Hannah. You can't always rely on Daddy's money." His words stung. I retreated to our room, feeling alone and betrayed. The man who once defended me in public was now a stranger, echoing his parents' harshness. The situation at home became increasingly difficult. Chris's parents treated me more like a burden than a family member. One afternoon, Mr. Johnson cornered me in the living room. "Hannah, you need to fix things with your father. We need that money," he demanded, his eyes cold and calculating. I stood my ground, although my voice shook. "I won't beg my father for money. I thought you welcomed me as family, not for my father's wealth." He laughed bitterly. "Family? No, we thought you were our ticket to an easy life. But you're just a spoiled brat with no sense of reality." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The loving family facade had fallen away, revealing their true motives. I was a means to an end, nothing more. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in on me. I was trapped in a house with people who saw me as nothing more than a cash cow, and the man I loved had turned into someone I didn't recognize. I missed my old life, but I was determined not to run back to my father. I had to figure this out on my own. But as the days passed, the weight of my situation grew heavier. I was stuck in a loveless marriage, with in-laws who only cared about what I could bring them financially. The harsh reality of my new life was nothing like the fairy tale I had envisioned. I was in a battle, not just for my independence, but for my dignity and self-worth. Living in Chris's parents' house, I, Hannah, was starting to feel the walls closing in on me. The atmosphere was tense, and the kindness I once saw in Chris and his family had completely vanished. Then, things started to disappear, first small items, then something big. One morning, I noticed my engagement ring wasn't on my bedside table where I usually kept it. Panicking, I searched the room, but it was nowhere to be found. "Chris, have you seen my ring?" I asked, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. He shrugged, not even looking up from his phone. "Maybe you misplaced it. It'll turn up." But it didn't. A few days later, I confronted Linda about it. "Linda, my engagement ring is missing. It's really important to me." Her response was cold, devoid of the warmth I once knew. "Maybe you should be more careful with your things, Hannah." I couldn't believe her indifference. That ring was the last symbol of the love Chris and I shared, or so I thought. Then, more items started disappearing, a pair of earrings here, a designer handbag there. It was like pieces of my old life were being erased, one item at a time. One evening, I caught Linda rummaging through my closet. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. Linda turned, a pair of my shoes in her hand. "We need money, Hannah. These things are just sitting here." I was shocked. "You're selling my things? How could you?" Chris walked in, overhearing the confrontation. "Hannah, we're struggling here. You can't just expect to live off us." I stared at him, disbelief and hurt welling up inside me. "So, you're okay with this? With your parents selling my belongings?" He avoided my gaze. "We have to get by somehow." I felt betrayed and alone. The people I once called family were now treating me like an ATM, disposing of my possessions without a second thought. Night after night, I lay awake, wondering how my fairy tale romance had turned into this nightmare. I was living with people who saw me as nothing more than a source of income. My love, my trust, my belongings, all were being taken from me, piece by piece. It was a harsh awakening. The life I had known, the love I had cherished, all seemed like a distant dream. I was trapped in a reality where I was nothing more than a means to an end, and my heart ached with the weight of this cruel revelation. The days at Chris's parents' house grew longer and darker for me. I was struggling to grasp the reality of my situation. I felt isolated, with my belongings disappearing and the family I married into showing their true colors. But nothing prepared me for the chilling discovery I was about to make. It was a late evening, and I was heading to the kitchen for a glass of water when I overheard hushed voices from the living room. Curiosity piqued, I tiptoed closer. It was Chris, Linda, and Mr. Johnson, talking in low, urgent tones. "We need to figure something out, and fast," Chris was saying, his voice laced with frustration. Linda chimed in, "We're at our wits' end. Hannah's not of much use anymore, not without her father's money." I felt a chill run down my spine. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear more. Mr. Johnson's voice was gruff. We could try reaching out to her father, make up some story. Maybe a health scare, something that'll make him open his wallet. My heart pounded in my chest. Were they really plotting to extort money from my father by lying? Chris's response was even more shocking. No, he won't buy it. We need something more convincing. Maybe if something were to happen to Hannah, an accident, he'd be more inclined to help. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My husband, the man I loved, was suggesting putting me in harm's way to get money. Linda's voice was cold. That might work. Her father would have to pay up then. I felt sick to my stomach. Trembling, I backed away from the door, my mind racing. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a threat to my safety. The next morning, Chris found me in the kitchen, his demeanor oddly calm. Hannah, you look stressed. Everything okay? I masked my fear, opting to keep my knowledge of their plan to myself. Just a headache, I lied. Chris's eyes narrowed slightly. You know, your phone is pretty valuable. We could sell it for some extra cash. Panic surged through me, but I had to think fast. Actually, I was thinking, maybe I could call my dad. Ask him for some money. Chris's expression changed to one of interest. Really? You'd do that? I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. Yes, I'll talk to him. Just let me keep my phone for now. He eyed me for a moment, then shrugged. Fine. But make it quick. We need the money. I nodded, relief washing over me. Keeping my phone meant I had a lifeline, a way to get help. As Chris walked away, I realized the gravity of my situation. I was in a house with people who saw me as nothing more than a cash cow, willing to go to any lengths to get what they wanted. That day, I understood the true colors of the man I married and his family. They were not the loving, caring people I thought I knew. Instead, they were predators, ready to sacrifice my well-being for their gain. Trapped in a house with people plotting against me, I was gripped by fear and desperation. With my father's number dialed on my phone, I faced Chris and his parents, who insisted on being present during the call. Go on, call him. We want to hear what he says, Chris demanded, a hard edge to his voice. Mr. Johnson stood with his arms crossed, nodding in agreement. Yeah, let's see if your daddy really cares. Taking a deep breath, I pressed the call button, my hands trembling. Dad, it's Hannah, I said, trying to sound calm. Hannah, what's going on? Dad's voice was filled with concern. Remembering the code phrase he taught me as a child, I said casually, Dad, do you remember my old teddy bear, Mr. Snuggles? I really miss him. There was a brief silence on the other end. Yes, I remember. Don't worry, we'll take care of it, Dad replied, his voice now stern with a hidden urgency. Chris and his parents looked at each other, confused by our cryptic exchange. So, is he going to send the money? Chris asked, his impatience growing. I nodded, playing along. Yes, he said he'll help us. An hour passed, the longest hour of my life. Chris and his parents were smirking, confident in their deceitful plan. But their smug expressions turned to horror as the front door was suddenly kicked open. Men in suits, clearly my father's security, stormed in. My father was right behind them, his face a mask of fury and concern. What the hell is this? Mr. Johnson blustered, stepping forward only to be restrained by the security. Chris stood up, his face pale. Mr. Anderson, what are you doing here? My father's gaze was icy as he walked up to me. Hannah, are you all right? I nodded, fighting back tears. Yes, Dad, I'm okay, now. He turned to Chris and his parents, his voice thundering through the room. You've been threatening my daughter, trying to manipulate her? That's not going to fly. Chris tried to speak, but the security team was already handcuffing him and his parents. The realization that their plan had failed was written all over their faces. As the police arrived to take over, my father wrapped his arm around my shoulders, leading me out of the house. The place I had once entered with hope and love was now a scene of a failed extortion plot. Sitting in my father's car, driving away from that nightmare, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The danger was over, thanks to the secret code and my father's swift action. After the terrifying ordeal with Chris and his parents, I found myself sitting in a courtroom, a mix of anxiety and determination in my heart. As I sat there, waiting for the trial to begin, my father, sitting next to me, squeezed my hand. "You're doing the right thing, Hannah," he whispered. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Chris, Linda, and Mr. Johnson were brought in, their faces a mixture of shame and defiance. The trial began, and it was my turn to testify. Standing there, facing the people I once called family, I felt a surge of courage. "Your Honor, these people manipulated and threatened me. They planned to harm me for financial gain," I said, my voice steady. Chris's lawyer tried to discredit me. "Isn't it true, Miss Anderson, that you're just a spoiled rich girl, upset over a family dispute?" I held my ground. "No, this is about them trying to use me. They saw me as nothing more than a cash cow." The evidence was overwhelming, especially the recording of their plot and the testimony from my father's security team. Chris and his parents sat there, heads bowed, as the reality of their actions sank in. Finally, the judge delivered the verdict. For the crimes of extortion and conspiracy to commit harm, I sentenced the defendants. The judge's words were a blur as relief washed over me. Justice was being served. Chris and his parents would pay for what they did. After the trial, my father and I walked out of the courthouse. "I'm sorry, Dad, for not listening to you," I said, tears in my eyes. He hugged me. "It's okay, Hannah. You thought you were in love. We all make mistakes." As we walked, I realized this was more than just a trial. It was a lesson in trust, a hard-earned understanding of the world's harsh realities. I had been naive, but now I was wiser, stronger. My father's car pulled up, and before I got in, I looked back at the courthouse. This chapter of my life was closed, but a new one was beginning. A chapter where I would be more cautious, more aware of people's true intentions.